Astrology interview with me, Sue Brain. And I've got with me today Victor Oliver, who's the editor of the Astrological Journal.
Hi.
And I'm particularly keen to have him here with me as a guest because I want to talk to him about Geoffrey Cornelius, who has died recently. And I know, Victor, that you've been very keen on his work and very celebratory of his work. So just want to talk to you about who he was and what he gave to the astrological community.
He really was a major figure of our time in astrology. We'll come to why he was a major figure, but he was at heart a polymath. He was an expert in so many different things, whether it's esoteric philosophy, whether it's in-depth psychology and things like that. He was at heart, I think, an historian, but he had a philosophical, analytical mind. And the big controversy about him, or is it that controversial? I don't know. Some of what I'm about to say may seem obvious to you, but he very much wanted to bring back the divinatory understanding of astrology. That was the big thing. And the book that did it, the book that will be read in 500 years' time, is this, The Moment of Astrology, Origins in Divination. And if you can get a copy, people, I would highly recommend that you do. At the moment, I think it's a bit scarce because he died only in August in Herne Bay. And mysteriously, we don't actually have a horoscope for him. He always kept his birth details secret, but we do know a secret spy in Herne Bay tells me that he was Capricorn, and he was 79 when he passed away.
Right, a lovely Capricorn. So that's quite interesting. A Capricorn is sort of quite earthbound, but he was very interested in, as you say, divination and bringing that understanding back into astrology. So just for people who don't understand what that means, what does it mean?
Well, divination by itself means obtaining information through a supernatural agency. That's the clinical etymological definition of the. You know, we talk about divines, we're talking about priests, seers, clairvoyants, astrologers, or whatever. And when we use the word divination, what we're accepting is that rational understanding alone does not explain the process of astrology. And the reason why he became quite a contentious figure is because we live in a time of hyperscience, when we're trying to weigh and measure everything. You know, one day AI may replace Sue Brain. Who knows? Sue Brain, you know, the AI Sue Brain may be. In other words, we've become so sophisticated in our understanding of natural law, which we then use to our advantage, that we then try to detach what we do as astrologers from the divinatory and try to explain it in scientific terms, as if it's a rational cause and effect process only. There is a literalness to astrology. We'll come to that. But without acknowledging the supernatural aspect of it, and there's the dangerous word, that's why he was quite a contentious figure.
I think it's really interesting because the Age of Enlightenment had a lot to answer for, but it really did push astrology into the sidelines, because if you can't see it, you can't prove it. It doesn't exist.
Well, it's interesting, you know, it's not just science. Even in the period of the great religions, you know, we're very much in the post-religious age now. But in the time of the great times of the religions, if they were great, astrology attempted, even in the past, to detach itself from the divinatory because it didn't want to seem to be challenging orthodox religion. That was turf war, you see. So it was something else. And in the age of science, we're trying to align ourselves with science in order to obtain respectability. But I'm afraid to say, I'm going to say something that's going to probably upset the world of astrology. Let's not seek respectability. Let's accept. I mean, you know, it's not just Geoffrey Cornelius. Liz Green, in one of her essays, explains, she's trying to understand what is the role of the astrologer. And she says the best way to understand the astrology is as a priest, as a mediator between what's known and what's unknown. So when we come to the divination thing, which we'll explore in a moment, that's the territory we're going into.
I think that's really interesting. So before we go into that, what I would like to understand the difference between divination, magic, augury, and horary.
Well, the first three are interlinked. I mean, take augury, for example. That's using omens for forecasting and things like that. And
Just to jump in there, my favorite example of augury, if anybody's seen it, is Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, when Geraldine McHugh is stabbing the entrails to give Alan Rickman whatever he wanted to say. That word augury comes up, and
Well,
immediately I go to that.
I've seen something rather interesting recently. I
Oh, yeah.
daren't mention it. Russell Grant's magazine. I love Russell Grant. And he had a wonderful essay written by somebody about the reading of ants' nests.
The reading of ants.
The reading of ants' nests. I think it's called Murnerology or something like that. I'm sure Russell Grant will come on and correct me, but it's got a weird name I've never heard of before. But the point of the matter is this.
Yes.
Cornelius actually came into astrology through the I Ching. So he was always interested in divination from the worst. But to go back to your question, augury, what was the other ones?
Magic,
Forecasting. Sorry?
magic,
Magic.
divination, and
Yeah.
horary.
Well, dealing with the first three,
Yeah.
the common defining characteristic of all is that they are divinatory, that they are using something we call supernatural, or we could call it something else. Maybe I will. But I think supernatural is a useful word to take us into the right territory. As to horary, horary is a very good example of the divinatory side of astrology, because it assumes that the moment the question is asked or understood is the moment to address a question. So you
Yeah.
don't need a birth chart. It is, in essence, something that seems to come out of the blue, and yet out of the blue, a chart is created which can answer a question. So horary is a very good demonstration of the divinatory art.
And would you say then, with horary, you're using your intuition as well as your astrological skills?
Most definitely, and that goes to the heart of Geoffrey Cornelius's argument. He says that any art, and he calls it an art, not a trade or whatever, intuition again accesses us to, how should we call it, a realm of knowledge which we don't really have a proper word for. I mean, he uses this weird word. I've determined to use it, and I'm going to use it. Synderesis.
Synderesis. Oh,
Yeah, it's a
Cinderella.
synderesis. And what that means, it means obtaining information from the highest part of our soul. What does that mean? You're not going to find it in a human biology book.
Well,
But
you're
he
talking about the higher self, accessing the higher knowledge, the higher self, that part of us that is connected to something greater, and we contain the knowledge of the universe.
Yes, and intuition is part of it. And it's not just for astrology. I mean, you can get it as a lawyer. You might have an intuition about a great truth that you're picking up in, say, a court claim or something like that. We've all have intuitive hunches at times if we're open in our minds to that energy and we're listening to ourselves. But certainly intuition lies at the heart of astrology. Now, the danger of that argument, of course, is that you're saying, oh, it's a bit woo-woo. It's not what you've learned in the textbook. It's not what, blah, 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 wrote in all the cookbook that you've just suddenly read on the internet.
Yeah.
All that is relevant because astrology does have a strong, practical, literal truth to it. But he talked about the sacred space of the horoscope. And there's the interesting thing. It's through the symbolism, which lies at the heart of astrology, mystical symbols that are like portals or doorways to a higher knowledge. But of course, there are conditions. One is that you actually know your subject for the most part. And the second is that you're bringing the right attitude to the horoscope so that you're not treating the horoscope as an amplification of ideas you've already got, but that you're allowing the chart to talk to you. And then through the symbols, which are doorways, you do access or can access information which seems to come from another realm. And it's demonstrated in outcomes like getting the answer right in a horary chart when you say, is my cat dead? Or where are my chickens? Things like that.
It's interesting, isn't it? So it's the skill is then to step beyond yourself and your own ideas of what's going on, and actually allow the chart to talk to something higher than just your understanding of life.
Yes, that's brilliantly put, actually. That's exactly what it is. And the problem, I think, with the science approach is that we devalue ourselves as astrologers. What we're saying, in effect, is that astrology is an automatic process that somehow works of its own volition. As Geoffrey Cornelius reminds us in his book, which is so full of common sense, if you don't have a witness to the chart, somebody actually understands the symbols, you don't have a chart, you don't have any significance whatsoever. You
It's
have
just,
to have
yeah,
somebody who understands the significance.
yeah. I really get that because before I really got into astrology, I looked at charts and it was just like, well, what's that mean? And then you kind of want to know it's so difficult when you can't understand unless you understand the symbology of, let's say, Saturn in Aquarius or um, Pluto in Virgo, whatever. And then you can begin to understand it. Then, as you say, the doors begin to open, don't they?
That's very much how it works. And he was very good. I mean, very academic. I mean, his approach is quite intellectual,
Mm,
but he
true.
very much identified the fact that when you're looking at the chart, in a way, if you're immersing in the symbolism, if you're believing in it, I dare to use that word. We'll come back to the belief system question in a
Yes.
moment. If you're believing in it, then the operation of astrology works at a literal and metaphorical level. Indeed, he describes the horoscope as a metaphorical mirror because it is the interaction between the mind and psyche of the astrologer and whatever is in the chart, which, in my opinion, by the way, Cornelius never said this, the
Yeah.
chart is indifferent to us. There's not
Yeah.
some moral impetus running through a chart. It is an abstract.
And I think that is proved by, if you have your chart done by, let's say, 3 astrologers, they will all use the symbols to open over the portals, but each one may give a different reading. The themes might be the same, but they will approach it in a different way.
It's very interesting you say that, and that's absolutely the case. You know, recently I completed a course at the School of Traditional Astrology with Deb Halding and Wade Caves. Now,
Yes.
we were studying loads of charts. I think 400 charts we looked at in the course of the course. But don't be put off, people. If you're interested, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
But what was interesting is that when we were set tests, there was a right and a wrong answer because we knew the answer already. We didn't know personally, but the course tutors knew the answer. So at some level, there is a practical side to astrology, which intellectually you can detach from the so-called esoteric. But when you're actually thinking about the astrologers, like William Lilly, for example, who was the major um, recreator of horary as we understand it today,
Mm.
and he was actually channeling ancient sources in building up Christian astrology, which is the classic book on the subject. But clearly there was a strongly intuitive element to his work and the work of other horarists too. So that what's complicated about this is trying to take on board two different realities, both of which work together in sync.
Yes.
And that is the literal, is my cat dead? That's the literal. Yes, your cat is dead. No, your cat is alive. It's
Yes.
under a bush northeast of your house. You can get that literal. You can do it. But there are processes going on in the interpretation that may tell you other things about, say, a relationship question. What
Yes.
led the person to this point? What may happen later? You can not just giving yes and no answers. Sometimes a yes and no answer may not be relevant. In other words, once your intuition is locked in, it opens up rather like a TARDIS.
Yeah. I'll tell you something that I wonder if this happens in horror as well. But because for me, when I prepare a chart for a client, I can sort of get an understanding of who they are and I can get a feel for it. I can get the feel for all the themes. But it's when I'm with them that the magic happens, that something else opens up. And when I was working as a psychotherapist, I used to call that when God used to walk into the room. This sort of something else used to come present, and that's when, for me, the magic happens. The intuition kicks in. The something else. The combination of their energy and my energy. When it really boom, oh my gosh, it's incredible. And I wonder if that's the same with horary. Is it good because you need the person to ask the question? And so does how you answer a question relate to how you relate to that person?
I think there's some truth to that. Of course, you're not talking to the right person for the ultimate answer. The reason why is because I'm happier as a remote astrologer. I'm happier with reports. But one of the things I learned from Deb Halding directly is that you do have to have some kind of interaction with the person. For example, the chart may tell you something of the physicality of the person. You know, what's the rising sign? Is Mars close? If Mars is involved, maybe they've got red hair or there's something reddish about them. I mean, that's being very simplistic.
Yes.
But that's the literal side of astrology. But also, I think there is a kind of strange magic, and by which I mean processes which we cannot rationally understand, but which we might call empathy or intuition or psychic link. You know, choose your
Yes.
words, it's up to you people. But
Yeah.
when I'm doing Zooms with people, I never do in-person stuff, but when I do the occasional Zoom, at some point there's a takeoff. You've looked at the chart, you've got a set of ideas. The person starts talking, you see some strange correspondences. Then the mind starts leaping forward. And you find you don't even have to look at the chart sometimes. You can just go bang.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
like a form of mediumship. So what you've
Yes.
described, I think a lot of astrologers, even so-called science type astrologers, understand the process we're talking about.
And I'm fascinated by that because
Well, it
does
makes
that
us divinatory.
yes, yes. But does that because that for me introduces the magic.
There's a
And is
lovely
that the magic that he was talking about, Geoffrey Cornelius?
Well, he was very clever as an intellectual academic. He was very clever to say this: don't treat each point he makes as a landing point. It's not meant to be used as dogma. In a sense, he's creating stepping stones which you can ascend if you wish to. You can easily go backwards and say, well, I'm not going to go up that incline.
Yeah.
But he was
Yes.
very clever to say that,
Yeah.
because a lot of what he's saying is abstract and sometimes speculative. It may be that he can source it to Plato. He can, he can cite all sorts of wonderful classic figures of history to support his contentions, his interpretation. But his interpretation was deductive. He realized that the astrology is so much involved in the process. And what is it that we can see beyond the symbols? You see, he's got this great line, which I'll read you just one line. The
Yeah.
astrologer is fundamentally implicated in the act of seeing the symbol. And divination doesn't work unless the psyche at some level is making that connection with a body of knowledge, which comes
Yeah.
back to that word synderesis. Omens didn't remember the word, but it's trying to find the doorway to the higher knowledge. And it's going in that direction takes you away from the science interpretation. It takes you away from religious ideas. But I'll root this in my Mercury and Taurus area. I do
Yes.
think it takes us into the idea of, is it a belief system?
Well, can I just chuck something in here because this is
Do.
to me as you're talking. I think when we open up to something, whatever the magic, I'm going to call it the magic. That's a very different reading than if you're just working with the symbols as you've learnt them, because
Most definitely.
that's a learnt that you can learn astrology. You can, because you can say, oh well, I don't know, Venus in Taurus loves nice
Yes.
things,
Yes.
but but when the magic happens, it's sort of like that symbology starts to glow in a different way, and suddenly something else, something maybe higher, I don't know what it is, starts to come in. But the other thing for me, which I find utterly fascinating, and I wonder if Geoffrey Cornelius has ever talked about this, is this whole concept of synchronicity, that clients come, they maybe have never done astrology before, and for whatever reason they've decided this is the time. And I had somebody yesterday, and she came because she felt like she was stepping in. She just said, feel like I'm being renewed. And her progressed son was sitting on her ascendant, waiting to
That's
go
amazing.
to her first house.
Well,
50 years in the dark. And I was like, oh my God.
yeah. I mean, he does actually talk about synchronicity, but in relation to correspondences. I mean, obviously the work of Jung is vital to our understanding of synchronicity. What is synchronicity? Well, it's a form of coincidence, but I think it's more to it than that. I think with Jung, he seemed to acknowledge that there was a fateful deterministic element. And we might call it coincidence, we may call it good fortune, we may say this. I mean, what you just described is a perfect example of synchronicity, in my
Yes.
opinion. Funnily enough, here's an act of synchronicity. I was looking at the midday chart of Keir Starmer this morning, and guess where his sun is? On the ascendant. His progressed sun is on his ascendant. So here again, could be the connection? There's no value to it, really. I mean, by the way, that's speculative because we don't actually have his time of birth.
Oh,
But
okay.
if you use the midday chart,
Yeah.
then his progressed sun is sitting exactly in his ascendant. So the synchronicity here is that we were both, you were telling that story while I was thinking, but I've just seen the progressed sun on the ascendant. It wasn't the transit, it was the progressed sun. But that's the way it works, you see. And I'll tell you another thing that I find when we talk about the intuitive divinatory side of astrology, and it
Mm.
happens with Hori. Somebody may come to you and say, should I marry this man or this woman? And if you're following the rules, you know, you're looking at who's the querent or the questioner, what's the quesited, or shall we look at the seventh house to see which planet is ruling? In other words, the technical stuff.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it may be possible to say yes or no, or maybe,
Yes.
but it's the yes or no that you're. But here's where the intuition starts. When you're connecting to the chart and then presumably to the person, you will see the bigger picture.
Mm.
Suddenly, the light that you're describing, or the glow, radiates to give the fuller context of what we're talking about, so that the question may prove to be redundant. It may be, yes, you can do this, but have you thought about that? Or you could do that, but then something else is going to happen. Maybe you can see Uranus standing, because in the star course, you can actually recognize the outer planet. Now, that's going back to the literal. But when you're talking about synchronicity, you're actually talking about the meshing of the literal and the psychic working to some determined purpose. And it's up to us to decide what we do with it. I mean, you can reject it. You can say, well, no, I don't want to do it. But when you see that things are meshed or in sync, that can be an encouragement then to pursue what happens next.
So what we're talking about here is people can get very hooked onto the question, should I, shouldn't I, without understanding whatever when a decision comes, whatever you decide, a consequence will arise. There will be a consequence which sets the next step in their journey of life.
But I've looked at Hori charts where the question is asked. It's usually something very mundane, such as I've given to you.
Yeah.
And never forget the practical side of astrology. But by immersing yourself in the chart, allowing the synderesis to link in, shall we say, the gods, or the capital I intelligences that Geoffrey Cornelius talks about in his book, you suddenly see sometimes, yes, you can ask the question, it's called free will. And yes, you're entitled to an answer. But it may not be an answer you want to hear. And there may be another question that you should have asked, or alternatively, you work out that the question asked is not the question that they wanted answered.
So
It
what
gets
they're doing,
tricky.
yeah. So what they're doing is sort of holding up a little flag, going, I want to work this out, but I don't know really what I want. But let me just ask you this anyway. And
Absolutely.
yeah, isn't that
And
interesting?
also, you may discover the querent is perhaps not as straightforward as you first thought. There may be indicators in the chart that put you on alert to that. And you
Would
can
they
get
be?
situated. Sorry?
Would
Well,
they?
one example might be if the ascendant point is in the last degree of the sign. That might be an example of a question that's not sincere or is completely inappropriate. There are other indicators too, which we could be here spend the rest of the show talking about that.
Yeah.
But there are indicators to put you on alert. You're looking for indications in the chart at a literal level that describe the person or the question. For example, if you come to me with a financial question or if a missing possession, then you'd be looking at the sign on the cusp of the second house and what rules it.
Sessions. Yes.
Gemini be Mercury, that sort of thing.
Yes.
So then you're looking at the relationship between the querent's ruling planet and the ruling planet of the second house. Also looking at the moon as well, which is the co-significator. That will tell you a lot too about the question, because the moon may itself literally reveal something that didn't even come up in the question.
It's all so Fascinating.
Can I tell you a little story? Very quick one. One of
Yes.
the famous horrors of Geoffrey Cornelius is known as the missing fish. He had ordered a consignment of fish, which then disappeared. So he being a horrorist, he drew up the chart and worked out that he was looking for a peregrine planet. In other words, a planet that has no essential dignity. If you don't know what it is, look it up, Google it, and that you still won't understand it. But if you take the course, you'll understand it. But it has no essential dignity. In other words, it's a bit of a wild planet, and it represents the thief. And in this chart, Jupiter represented the thief. It was disposited by Mars, or ruled by Mars, in Scorpio, or in another water sign, I should say. In other words, it was a very watery chart. So the thief lived by water, and I think the Mars may be moving into Sagittarius. Remember, I don't know all the details, but I'm just giving you the essence.
Yeah.
In other words, he worked out who it was and identified the individual and actually got an arrest warrant. And they found the fish. Now, that's a very good example of literal astrology, how literal horror can be. But it's what I'll tell you, what takes us in the direction of divination is that you're not just looking at the planets or their condition, you're also factoring in, working with so many different components.
Yes.
The mind at some level has to reduce it. And in the process of doing that, in getting to the essential significations and all the rest of it, you are accessing super information from some other place. It's not just astrology.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's like when you write a letter to somebody that you don't intend to send, maybe that you're wanting the story and you can't make sense of it. And the story starts to unfold through your imagination. And later you find out that that's the truth.
It's the same process, It's like we said earlier that you don't actually have to be an astrologer to do what we're doing. But on the other hand, I think the point about astrology is that it's focused information, and we mustn't devalue the practical side of it. Saturn does represent Saturn. I've got Saturn on my moon at the moment, which is playing havoc with my concerns about material security in a home and things like that. So we can make these obvious connections between the chart and real life. But to get the greater understanding as astrologers, you have to immerse in the totality of the chart.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that's the represents the totality of the person. So we're multi-dimensional, complex people, which is you got your sun somewhere, then your moon somewhere else, and then you got your rising sign something else, and that all goes these amazing different layers of how we relate to life.
Trying to explain it to a muggle, I shouldn't use that word, should I?
No, not really, but
But
never
if
mind.
you try, even if you explain it to certain astrologers, you can see their eyes glazing.
Yeah,
Oh, it's so complicated. But actually, it's like anything.
yeah,
Baking a cake, there's lots of different elements to it to get it right. So
yes, and that all makes
what we're saying is not that exceptional. We're just acknowledging that there's a complexity to it that cannot be explained simply by calling it scientific.
yeah. Now,
Sorry.
go on. I just want to talk more about how augury. I just love I'm back with Geraldine McEwen at the moment. How does that fit into that?
Well, in some respects, again, I may be stretching the point, but I don't think I am. Omens are signs from the gods.
Yes, yes,
But it can be superstition too, and so we've got to make a distinction between the two. Um, if you think about ancient Rome, it was a time, I think it's Ray Grass that uses the word, it was an omenologist's dream. If lambs fell out of the sky because an eagle had dropped it, that was an omen of something. So they were forever reading omens or signs from that seemingly were miraculous or seemed anachronistic, but they were telling you something. So in many ways, omenology, if I can use that awful word, which probably doesn't exist, it is rather like astrology in that it is, again, another manifestation of a supernatural agency, that some energy or intelligence in a higher sphere is trying to warn us of something or to alert us to something. And what do we do as astrologers? You could say that we are omenologists too. I mean, in the strict etymological sense, they are two different things. But we are reading omens in the charts.
yes, we are, aren't we? We are. Gosh, it's fascinating, isn't it? because
And
they
I want to, it is
symbol
fascinating.
the symbols are omens, if you like, or actually maybe the omens are the aspects.
I think it's all of the above, to be honest with you, because ultimately you're accessing information which ordinarily you should not know rationally. Let's face it. You look
Yes.
at the chart. Let's go back to basics
Yeah.
and back to that phrase, that beautiful phrase that Geoffrey Cornelius came up with, the metaphoric mirror. And what you're doing is converting actuality into a metaphorical narrative in order to understand something from another perspective and to allow the light to open up the recesses that even the questioner has not even thought about. Why should you, as a stranger, Madam Astrologer, Mr. Astrologer, whatever you do, why should you be able to obtain that information? How is it done? An omen may tell you something that you could not possibly know because it is itself a symbol. And
Yeah.
when you're looking at your chart, yes, you're looking at glyphs, but
Mm.
you're reading symbols. You're entering a mystical,
Yes.
otherworldly realm. But you have to understand that it's a relationship that will only shed its light if you allow it to exist in its own way. So, at
Yeah.
a literal level, yes, you're going to be answering the question. You may be telling somebody about their natal chart, that sort of stuff. But then at some point, as you've explained, the light, it glows, it opens up to another realm, and you may surprise your client with what you tell them when they confirm what you say is true.
Well, they get blown away.
They may do.
They
I've
certainly
had
do.
many clients. I had quite a famous, I won't name names obviously, but I had quite a famous person consult me in the political arena. And okay, so I'm bragging, but I made a forecast that within 2 years a certain something would happen, and that something has happened, much
Yes.
to their advantage.
Yes.
Now, that's a good example of literal astrology working on a mundane level. But there's something else which I cannot go into too much. But the chart opened up motivations. What's the purpose of it all? You know, you can say, I want power. But the chart revealed to me, and it was confirmed, why this person is doing it.
Mm.
And that didn't even come into the question. You
It's
see.
yes. Yes, it's the motivation, isn't it? I think that's
What's the higher purpose being served? You see,
yes,
and this person
absolutely
had great spiritual
calling.
awareness.
This person, yeah, I can only imagine this person had a calling and didn't know, when you have a calling, it's just like, well, where's that come from? And when you're with an astrologer can help you to work out what that calling is about or how they may be able to go forward with that calling.
You see, it goes back to the question or to the issue I said to you before. I always, if I want to upset my fellow astrologers, I'll say that, of course, it's not a science astrology, it's a belief system. Now, that usually upsets people. I'll tell you why, because they think, oh, you're saying it's like religion. It only works because you believe in it. Well, there are two sides, and as ever, there's in one answer to that one. A client comes to you, let's say the client doesn't really think astrology is much cop, but
Hmm.
the point of the matter is, it's not what the client thinks, it's what the astrologer is doing. It's
Yes.
what the astrologer is doing in terms of connecting to what they see in the horoscope and becoming witness to their own observation and considerations.
Yeah.
So when we talk about a belief system, if the astrologer does not vest their faith in the symbolism, which tends to come from ancient deity worship, if you think about it, then
Myth. Mm.
of course it's a belief system, but it doesn't mean that the client's got to believe it. The astrologer does, though.
Yes, absolutely. And that's where they're coming from. But in my experience of working with clients, it's a very different experience working with a client that's open and receptive to one that's just kind of testing it out. It's a very, very different experience. It's like going for a cup of tea with somebody who's very closed and doesn't want to reveal very much. And it's quite not awkward, but it's just kind of like you do your duty and then you leave to somebody who's totally like, I just want to enter into this with you. It's a whole different vibe.
In that case, then you really are, to use that horrible word, it becomes a journey of some sort, a very
Yes,
revealing one.
yes.
But I've had clients who are, you can tell by their reactions that they become very literal. because they're trying, in a sense, to keep the level of it at where they understand the matter to be,
Yeah.
which can be nowhere, or they have a fixed idea of what they think you're doing.
Yes.
And so one does tend to, actually, I tend to get literal with them, because I know that the journey is not going to happen, but we can have a little micro journey, and I can
Exactly.
answer your question. Yes, you're going to fall in love and blah, 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 blah. But unfortunately, they're not receptive to what else I might have to say about the nature of that love, or about the nature of the experience and how it might end up.
And we have to stay where our clients are most comfortable.
I think so.
I think so too.
I
I
think
mean,
that you can't talk down to a client. They've
absolutely.
chosen to come to you of their own free will. And people talk about determinism. They seem to forget. First of all, somebody makes a decision to consult you. You decide whether you want to be consulted. You then choose to look at the data. You then interpret, which is partly a free will act, by the way, people. The whole process is governed by free will, but
Yeah.
there are indicators in the omens or the glyphs or whatever you want to call it, which may take you in a direction you did not even think about.
Yes, absolutely. And it can open as the readings are going on, it can deepen and deepen and deepen as something like, oh my gosh, this is extraordinary. Yes. Victor, I'm just so interesting. Oh my gosh. Just conscious of time. Um, I know you've just started a new magazine called Stella. Would you like to
Yes,
say
it's
something about this?
yes, it's an online magazine. It's probably going to it's going to still be called Stella, but it may be called Stella Astro or Stella Astrological. We released the pilot issue in the September-October issue of the Astrological Journal. It is very much part of a overall initiative of the Astrological Association to reach a larger, largely younger global audience. It's free. If you go to the Astrological Association website, you can see it, read it for nothing. And we're getting thousands of views already, partly because it's free, but also we're getting very positive feedback. I picked up that we weren't reaching a vast global younger audience, and that's what it's designed for. And it's designed to be read on your phone, on your iPad, or whatever. And there we are.
That's so exciting. And the link to this interview will be in that free magazine.
Yes, of course, it will be sitting independently elsewhere too, like YouTube, I guess. I mean, it's your show.
Oh, absolutely.
But we'll be happy to host the video.
Yeah.
And I mean, as I say, you can easily access the magazine on the astrologicalassociation.com and enjoy. It takes you into the world of astrology, because the journal will continue as a membership magazine. It's designed for serious astrologers, lengthy essays, lots of notes, all that stuff. But Stella is much more concise. It's packaged. It's meant to be read quickly and understood, like synastry. We call it fast synastry. So we'll look at a pair and we'll just give you the lines. We'll give you the lines. What we're not going to do is to give you a long essay on synastry. Okay.
No.
If you're interested, go and study it.
Victor, thank you so much. I've so enjoyed this conversation. It's just made
So
me
have I.
really think more about the magic of astrology and what we're working with. And wow, this sense of, I suppose it's just connecting with consciousness, isn't it, really?
Yes, and one thing I wanted to say, these days we think of magic as illusion. We talk about illusionists, but we have to get away from the idea that we're talking about optical illusions or tricks. We're actually talking about a world that we cannot precisely identify, but which we intuit through the knowledge we obtain through symbols.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'm sure I'm going to get you back on again.
Oh,
So
it's great. I always love talking to you. Of course, you're Aquarius, I can tell. And Gemini, Aquarius. I mean,
see you soon.
See
Bye.
you soon. Thank you very much. Bye.